amazingly rapid. So as an obvious example, I took my job in Winnipeg in 1970. And at that point, there were 2 of us looking for jobs, but there were 10 jobs going in the country. Most of the people who ended up in those positions, who were not Canadian, were of course bought in because there was nobody in the country. I mean, it's a very, let me put it this way, I am more than aware that I came through a totally different system. I mean, you might as well have drawn me in on an Orwellian time machine in terms of academics and what it meant on this. I taught for University of Winnipeg for 4 years before I completed my PhD. And I taught graduate students at the University of Pennsylvania in 67, 68 while I was completing my master's degree. I was Francis Johnson's replacement at the University of Pennsylvania in 67, 68 on this. So a different world. You think I'm an old codger, I am on this. So, terrific rapid growth, basically from 1 or 2 in 64, 65 to the 12. But only Toronto and Montreal had graduate programs, and that situation continued for effectively another decade. So they say they've grown to considerably more by 72, which is where CAPA starts on this one. And the programs begin at the end of this. And I believe, and I can be corrected on this, to my knowledge, the only non-Toronto PhD in physical anthropology or a related discipline not from Toronto, I'm leaving Montreal aside here, is Ross McPhee from Alberta in 77. And I suspect that Ross's degree was from paleontology. If you've worked in primate paleontology, Ross is a very, very big figure indeed. Famous for his work on ear mechanisms and the whole definition of what is a primate. And he's just retired after being curator of mammalogy at the American Museum of Natural History for the last 25 years. The other end, at the beginning of his career, in terms of the other side of being there, is that Ross was my first sabbatical replacement. The first year that I went on sabbatical, Ross replaced me. And Ross almost left the discipline 2 years later, in 1980, to go back to medical school because he could not find a position on this. So that's the other side of it. There were either jobs or no jobs on this. Ross landed on his feet with a job at Duke and never looked back. So, no professional association. Osteologists either went to the CAA, if they were archaeologists in this case. The only other Canadian group was sociology dominated, was the Canadian Sociology and Anthropology Association, and basically it was the Canadian Sociology Association with a few random anthropologists added. And so you get CAPA within that context. I don't have a date for the founding of CAA, it's a generation earlier. And of course the break in cultural anthropology with the CES, founded in the late 70s, 74. So, what happened in Kansas? Jerry and I are scratching our heads. No, it's not the case here. About 300 people attended, so bigger than the meeting here. I'm going to come back to another figure later for CAPA. I went through the AAPA meeting summary, and there are 33 people with Canadian address in the meeting summary on this. And 8 people delivered by people with Canadian addresses. A large number of them were people working with Brunetta Chiarelli, who had come to Toronto and was doing genetic work, I believe. I think 4 of those 8 papers were delivered by Chiarelli students. I believe Emeka gave a paper at Lawrence. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think, yeah, in this. This case, I now have a little, actually talking to Jerry, got a little bit more sense of what happened, because one of the questions that's obviously going to come out, this again is the change in 40 years, is, my God, it was a bunch of men. Where the hell was that, excuse me, where was everybody?
Because you were all going to drink beer. Who the hell?
Well, we were, excuse me. I'm sure we were drinking beer, but if not something else. What was Loring's favorite drink? Loring was in the room. I tried to get hold of Loring Brace to see if I could get any input from him, but he has not replied at this point, which either means he's not well, he's not monitoring his emails, he doesn't want to talk to me, or he's away. I've known Loring since this meeting. What I think happened was the following. I went because Jamshed Mawalwala invited me to take part in an opening evening presentation on a debate formulated on the proposition, physical anthropology is dead. I found out when I got to the meeting that the person who had been pitted against me, I was at this point, I've been teaching at Winnipeg for 2 years. I did not have my PhD in hand. I showed up at this meeting, was told, oh, the person who is going to rebut you is Loring Brace on this. And I said, you've got to be, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I think happened was that Jamshed, who had become a personal friend. When I first met Jamshed, those who know Jamshed have very mixed reactions to him. I met him after I'd taken all my courses, and we became close personal friends, my wife and his wife included, on this, so it was very much not an academic relationship in the classical sense. Jamshed, myself, and Loring decided to get together. Charlie Iman, who some of you will know, others won't, a character of renown, especially in archaeological and CAA circles. Very good osteologist, but also a cantankerous whatever on this. I believe that Charlie and I were sharing a room at Lawrence. So Charlie was there, and Jim Pattison was the other physical anthropologist at Calgary at the time. So he joined in, and Jeff Garrity, who at this point was a McMaster, was a very close personal friend from the group that had arrived in '64 at Toronto and worked with Oshinsky. So we all decided to get together and have a couple of beers. Frank Auger, also from Montreal, who I had previously met. Yes, that's the other figure on this. And we got together in the room, and at some point, somebody unwisely said, why do we have to come to Lawrence, Kansas to meet other Canadians? I can almost literally, that's almost a direct quote. I cannot assign it to anybody. But the end result of that was that Charlie Iman and Jim Pattison went back to Calgary with the task of organizing a meeting which was held the following year, 1973, in Banff. And the formal founding of the association was at the Banff meeting. So in this case, the group here, two are deceased. Charlie died a number of years ago, as did Frank Auger, both in the 1990s on this. And when I did put this together, I had forgotten the connection with Loring. So I think at this point I would not say may also have been present, but my dim memory is Loring was in the corner, probably kibitzing. So meeting was held in February '73. 34 people, that included the organizers, attended on this, with a founding president in Frank Auger, founding secretary-treasurer in Braxton Alfred, who was a geneticist who taught physical anthropology at the University of British Columbia in this. The meeting was founded, second meeting in Trent with 62. And, okay, from this base, I'm not going to go on with a formal history. You can follow the track here. I tried to see if I could figure out who the 29 people other than the founders were at Banff, and I have not been able to fully sort that one out. The earliest list I can find is from '76, and I think his post-Cedar Glen meeting, which would have been, I think, the 4th meeting on this. So I don't have a list of the 29. I was asked a question, why is it the Canadian Association for Physical Anthropology rather than of physical anthropologists? And I think the answer is because at least half the people at the Banff meeting were not per se anthropologists. There was a large component of people doing human genetics. I remember somebody, I think it was Brian Lowry, for example, who was doing work on cleft palate in children in the Northwest Coast. There was a huge group around that type of frame. So it was not physical anthropologists, but the discipline that was at the core here. So in this case, we have the growth. Fluctuated as far as I can find out from going through the records, the full membership between the hundreds, 170s. As I say, largely it goes up and down depending on the number of graduate students, and it's always been like that, and I understand that it still is on this. And the last figure I got was over 60 papers and abstracts. I don't have a figure for this meeting, but I gather we have 130, 140 people here, although somebody told me that last year's Montreal meeting was larger with approximately 200 people. I wasn't at the Montreal meeting. And at the same time, the number of PhD programs, to my counting, has grown to 6 from the original 2, and 3 further departments with MA programs. And putting this into context with my own history in the discipline, I went to my first AAPA meeting at the end of my first year at University of Toronto with 4 other people. Jeff Garrity certainly was one of them. May have been Jim MacDonald, and I don't know who the 4th person was. And at that meeting, there were 162 people and 49 papers. And at this point, therefore, this association is roughly the same size as the AAPA was when I went to my first meeting. I believe, by the way, I hope this is not a warning, I believe this is the first meeting, the last meeting that they were able to get away without having overlapping sessions on this. I also had a figure, but I have not been able to track this, and the only thing I got said it's not true. There was something in the back of my mind that said that this was the first meeting, the Penn State meeting, where they had over 100 people registered. So even the AAPA was small at the time. It was not the association today, but if you get the right location. Is it up to 2,000 yet? Last time I went, it was about 1,500 people. So, about 3 minutes. I'm going to go through the rest much faster. I simply wanted to end up this. It turned out to be a bit longer than I thought. We're saying, okay, what can happen to somebody who got into this field? I've got a line at the very end, and I'm going to add it at the beginning also. I am an incredible believer in serendipity. There is almost nothing that happened during this period, during my career, that does not have something to do with something previous, the law of unintended consequences. If I had not walked up to Jim Anderson in the hall at University of Toronto and said, I am really a little burned out, I need a break, he wouldn't have walked up to me in the hall the next week and said, with you and Belle is my wife, and if you're wondering in terms of that picture in the thing, I'm the tall one. I'm the tall, thin one. The woman on the right side of that picture is my wife. That picture was taken about this period, late 60s.
That's the far right.
Pardon me?
The far right.
Far right. No, not the woman right beside me. That's a friend. She's still a very good friend. She lives in Montreal. But the woman on the far right is my wife. Anyway, Jim walked up to me in the hall and said, would you and Belle like to go to Philadelphia for the year? I've just had a call from Frank Johnson, who's looking for somebody to teach in his place. I basically got a job unseen. I never got a contract, showed up the next year and taught for a year. very, very, very different world on this. So in this case, in terms of my life, as Jerry said, we go through this fast, starting in biology and geology. I actually met Larry before I came to Toronto. It's one of the reasons I came to Toronto. Larry was at the National Museum and was teaching a course at St. Patrick's College, which then was an independent small college. He was teaching a course at night. I was suggested I go and take it by my advisor, who knew I wanted to go into anthropology. And I met Larry. The next year he went to move to Toronto, and the year after I moved to Toronto as well on this. As Jerry indicated, my initial work stemmed from Larry's work, The Most Ancient Eskimo. I then got that, produced a Master of Philosophy. Larry was my initial director. Jim was the person I worked with after that. I then taught at Penn, and my PhD was directed by David Rees-Hughes, who died, I believe, in 2003 on this. My work was 2008, sorry, can't read my own, my own slides here. And that was in part based on ideas actually, again, from Larry. Larry had ideas that suggested that population differentiation only began in the post-Paleolithic, and that Paleolithic society would not result in isolate formation. And I was fascinated by the idea, and I went off to work with Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic material in '68, and finished the degree in '74, with a PhD that is actually a study of social and biological systems rather than an analysis. In terms of unintended consequences and serendipity, I put in a PhD thesis proposal in which I suggested that I write an introduction on the relationship of social and biological systems in a glacial society, assuming that I could pull it out of the literature. Didn't exist. Didn't exist. 600 pages later, I had a model. So my PhD was a model that has actually been the base for much of the work that I've done since. So I examined skeletal material for a year in European collections. In terms of what happened to the PhD, I'm actually analyzing the data in a new project now, 40 years later. Taught at the University of Toronto for a year. The year after I taught at Penn, I came back to Toronto and they said, you've just taught at Penn, we'll put you into the classroom rather than have you go back to the role of student assistant. And I began teaching in Winnipeg in '70. In this case, since then, I've done a number of things, basically several different foci, but skeletal material and burial context, a lot of a tendency to move towards the burial context. And I've done a number of integrative projects in Europe. Got a list of them here: Holland, Portugal, Denmark, with 2 of the 3 still ongoing at various levels of activity. And I've been working on materials from Syria and Iran since the 70s at the same time. That work going on in Winnipeg. So I started out in skeletal biology. I've shifted to the archaeological context. And the way I would put it now in terms of, I'm a physical anthropologist, my comment is, I've got a toe out here testing the waters. But as I said at the beginning, most of my colleagues in Europe assume I'm an archaeologist because what I talk about to them is framed in archaeological terms, or at least partially in archaeological terms. So I started in work in Holland, and I'm going to show you some slides. And I'll go through these reasonably rapidly. I started by this is another serendipity case. While I was writing my thesis about 1972, I wrote a letter saying, you just published a C14 date. Is it from the site that I looked at in 1968? I said, oh, by the way, I'm interested in the collection. I got a letter back saying, yes, it's the date, and we've got somebody working on it. End of question. File it. 4 years later, I get a letter saying, the person who was working on it has left. Can you come to Holland next summer? That's my career. If that hadn't happened, I would have never gone back to Europe. I would have probably ended up working North American material. So I went to Holland in 1976. I published what, as Neolithic, a collection which I now view as being terminal Mesolithic, which is the period I've more specialized in, and later worked with the same group, produced a project, a full volume issue of Journal of Human Evolution on Mesolithic skeletal material that I'm currently in the process of revising. Again, 40 years later, almost. Just some context on this. Did I get two there? No. Here we go. The Dutch material, looking at sites here. This was the most recently reclaimed polder in the Dutch system. This is the old Zuiderzee, which they've been progressively draining. They drained it in the 50s, and they started running across sites. I was asked to come in and both do some of the excavation and analyze them. This is some of the idea here, what you were working with. Okay. What you've got here, this is a modern view. I'm not sure exactly the base, but this is the current system. It's currently laid out in its farming area, and you can see in the crop marks where the Holocene river systems were. And here is the archaeological map of the same thing, and we found sites all the way around the various river systems, salt marsh basis here, and this is just one of this is actually the last individual out of the main site that we excavated, with amber around his head and with a nice big triangular jet earring. Well ahead of his time. Portugal, much longer term project. As a number of you I suspect know, I've been working with Mary Jakes and David Lubell on this material since the early 80s. Just as that picture of me is the blast from the past, those who know David, this is David in 1983 at, I think it's the Aruda site, one of the big shell middens in the Tagus estuary. This case, some quick context. The Mouge sites are here at the top of the estuary in this. I put these other sites that David and Mary and I have worked on in the project since. Three large sites, the largest single Mesolithic series in the West. There's larger material in Eastern Europe on this. First excavated 150 years ago. My next meeting in March is the 150th anniversary meeting for the first excavations at Mouge on that. That's the paper I'm working on at the present. It's also been reworked since Mary and I were working on this. Mariana Roxandich, who is at the University of Winnipeg, has also been doing work at Mouge. Although what she'll be talking about, I think tomorrow, is on her more recent work in Cuba. She worked for about 5 years in Portugal, from about 2000 to 2005, I believe. And I worked on a lot of material with Mary, especially, Mary has produced much more on this than I have, her own influence on the dating diet, the pathology. Mary and I have recently published full demographic analyses of the 2 primary sites. And Mary and I continue to sort of slowly work a huge collection. This is simply an indication of what you can get when you get large population stuff. This is a seriation element from material that had been excavated in the 19th century and that we had to I would use the word, we re-excavated from the museum collections because there were no extant records. So we had to start from scratch on this. This simply shows the kind of thing that you can do with the data when you get it. This is from one of Mary's papers, and simply shows the 3 sites which are now clearly dated, and 3 different ways that we have been able to trace what was going on at the sites. So we get an indication that these changes, temperature, aridity in the area, a change in influence as ocean levels went down on this, produced a pattern of occupation, and at the end of this, it appears that the region was abandoned. And the Neolithic sites that follow are about 100 kilometers further north, and not in the same zone at all, totally different zone. In Denmark, the other project, I was asked to join the Vedbæk project following the resignation of Balslef Jorgensen, the anatomist from the project, in 1985, and I've been working on this since. The reasons for non-publication of this are complex, and I won't go into them here, but they involve the fact that when I went in expecting to find all the records, I found they were in Balslef Jorgensen's head, and nothing had been written down. And he was not interested in talking to anybody. The result is I had to start again from scratch. This is the man I work with in Denmark. I doubt any of you will know Eric. He is also a force majeure, but we get along extremely well. What you see is what you get with Eric. Work we have done includes a number of things. It includes work for the Danish school system. You'll probably have seen pictures of some of this material. It's widely published in introductory textbooks. This, for the Danish systems, is the triple burial, 2 adults and a child. And if your Danish is a little weak, it means have all three been murdered in this. One of the individuals, this individual, you can just see, they've replaced it with a knife, but there was a harpoon that went straight through here and into the front of the cervical vertebrae on this. By the way, if any of you teach this stuff, one of the things we will be saying later is this is always published as a woman, a child, a woman, a man, and a child. I am reasonably certain that this is 2 men and a child. Don't ask me for a social explanation, but I'm reasonably certain that this is 2 men and a child. So current work, since '75, I've done a lot of work recently. That should have read that. Yeah, sorry. Since retirement, yes. Don't. By this time, I'm getting tired too. I will be through this in a couple of minutes on this. I've been preparing the data that I collected in the '60s. And some of you may know Ron Pinhazi's work. He's been publishing a lot of material, European material, and recently material in AJPA on material from Armenia in Middle Paleolithic context on this. And I've been working with him since 2006 on this. I've also been updating the work that I did with the Dutch on Mesolithic skeletal material. Basically, I've been republishing it. Some of you may have seen the work with Ron that appeared in the volume that Ron and Jay Stock put out in 2011. And this is simply, I just pulled one of the charts out of the paper I have in there, which is on stature trends in European. This is simply, this particular one, if you wonder what on earth is this is date BP from 0 to 35,000. This is long bone length, because we plotted long bone rather than stature, and this is humerus length, change in time. And you can see that there are clear trends. This is the kind of work I'd be doing from that base. The other one on Mesolithic material, these are simply the maps from the last 2 publications, one in Ireland, one on Great Britain, on sites on that, and this is what I'm spending a lot of time on. I think I'm probably going to be working on these until they pull me out kicking and screaming, and I have my comment on serendipity and this, and I certainly would never have predicted that I would show up here 40 years later on this. My sources in this case, Jerry was very useful to me. The two of his recent papers. The other source for the Canadian Physical Anthropology is my article on Canada and Frank Spencer's 1997 volume. And the publication of the newsletter on the web has been unbelievably useful. And in this case, people I'd like to thank the association for making this particular presentation possible, to Mariana and Emeka for support in this, for Jerry for a lot of discussion. And thank you very much for coming and listening. We ramble on longer than I should have. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for speaking because it was we all have different perspectives of early years. And I wasn't a baby at that time, but I did earn my degree in '68, and so I remember things with slightly different perspectives, and I finished my PhD the same year you did. But I want to acknowledge that there are a number of people here who deserve recognition because of their loyalty to the field of physical anthropology, their enormous contributions to it, and many of them are actually grandparents in the discipline because they produced PhDs who have gone on to produce PhDs. I'd like to recognize first our distinguished speaker for tomorrow night, Dr. Ted Stegner, who came here and who actually came to the department, or at least contacted people in the department because of the work that he was doing in Northern Ontario on human adaptability among Cree and Ojibwa. And then we have Charles Merbs sitting here in front of me, who's been a favorite well, I think you just love the CAPA. You've always come to the meetings right from the very beginning. He was a student of Jim Anderson's and worked on the Inuit remains from Southampton Island for your PhD, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, so, and of course they're in the news lately because they have the variety of mitochondrial DNA, or at least one group there does. And so lots of connections and things come together. I think present at the very first meeting of the association in Banff was Linda Fedigan, who's here and who's produced an awful lot of PhDs in primate behavior, non-human primate behavior. And there are too many people to actually mention whom I have known for a long time, even though I don't come to the meetings all that often anymore. Ann Zeller, you mentioned Chiarelli. You've had worked with Chiarelli, right?
Yeah, sure, his first year at Toronto.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I also didn't realize, Chuck, that you had worked with Jim.
Yeah.
And I never put that one together.
One summer.
One summer.
But the
okay.
point is that
Nancy
we all...
Ossenberg.
And Nancy Ossenberg, absolutely. So
Yeah,
we all-
Nancy is the missing piece here. I wish Nancy had been here because she, in a sense, is one of the people who predated us all. The group of us who were working with Larry, Nancy was in the previous group. So Larry was very much talking about her as somebody who we should be emulating.
Well, I would like to say, just as an encouragement to the young people who are here, and relative to me, I'm old, so the rest of you are young. You know, there were no guarantees. I mean,
There were no
Chris
guarantees.
mentioned that, yes, he just walked into a job. It wasn't that easy. Don't ever believe him for that. And there were no guarantees. Many of us worked in areas that we had no predecessors really outside of skeletal biology. Archaeology dominated the scene in Canada. But if you believe in what you're doing, if you think that it's worth doing, that it's worth the intellectual effort, and you want to make contributions to your discipline, you can do it just as much as we did. And I think the fact that we're all here today and we've earned a good living and we have made our own contributions in our own ways, I think that speaks to the power of the discipline. It is a wonderful way to really understand your fellow human beings and all our predecessors in the past, animals included. So there you go. Thank you very much.
I had a question for Ted. Was the Penn State meeting your first meeting too? I mentioned Milford, and something tells me that that's where I met you for the first time.
It was my second meeting. My first one was in Madison, Wisconsin in 1959.
Okay.
And that group at that time was about this size, the Physical Anthropology.
You would have been there.
I was just going to say I was a graduate student at Wisconsin in 1959. I probably registered you.
Well, you know, there's an interesting connection here in terms of triangulation and 6 degrees of separation. One of the people who was at Madison at the time, and I think he must have presented at that meeting, was Werner Alexanderson, the Danish dentist. And Werner, his work has been working with me on the Danish project since the 1980s. It's a very small world.